All right, guys. So, the purpose of today's lecture is to discuss the changes in the cardiorespiratory system that occur across our lifespan. So, firstly, we'll begin by examining the features of the cardiorespiratory system that are closely related to physical capacity, and we'll discuss how these change across the lifespan. Then in part 2 and 3, we'll look at how cardiorespiratory fitness or our aerobic fitness, our aerobic capacity, affects health and performance in early life and then in late life. So we should all know that the cardiorespiratory system consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and they work together with the respiratory system, which includes the lungs and the airways. And together, this cardiorespiratory system carries oxygen to the muscles and the organs of the body and removes waste products, including carbon dioxide. So we're going to start off by looking at 4 key features of the cardiorespiratory system. We're going to analyze heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, and then finally maximal oxygen consumption, which is our VO2 max. So variation in these measures are very important determinants of exercise tolerance and our functional ability. We aren't going to go into too much detail about the anatomy and physiology of the cardiorespiratory system. That's outside the scope of this subject, so you may want to revisit that if necessary before continuing along with the lecture. All right, so straight into it, heart rate. We all know that our heart rate is the number of times our heart beats per minute. And here we're going to start by looking at our resting heart rate. So the heart rate of our body when we're just sitting down, relaxing. And our heart rate actually changes quite a bit across the lifespan. There's about a 50% decline in resting heart rate from birth to maturity. So at rest, a child's heart rate is consistently higher than an adult's. And in fact, the newborn infant's heart rate can average around 130 beats per minute. And that can actually range from anywhere between 120 to 140 is normal. So with age, this resting heart rate progressively declines. We can see on this slide here. So for example, by 1 year old, the average resting heart rate will have declined by about 40 beats per minute. And this trend is evident up until late adolescence, when young men exhibit an average heart rate of between 57 to 60 beats per minute, and young girls or females have a slightly higher heart rate at 62 to 63 beats per minute. Now, generally, there's no gender differences in heart rate until about 10 years old. And then females have that 3 to 5 beats per minute higher heart rate than males that we can see there during adolescence. So what we see here is a graph representing the centiles of heart rate for healthy children from birth to 18 years of age in this figure. So the green line running down the middle there is the median heart rate, and the blue lines represent the centiles. So overall, this data clearly shows a decline in heart rate with age from birth to adolescence. And that first section of the figure shows the heart rate for infants under 1 age. So it's got the age in months. And whilst we see the average here, if we're looking at that green line, it's important to recognize that there's actually quite a bit of variability in the resting heart rate of individuals, and this can be due to a number of factors, including even genetics. Here we're looking at the average resting heart rate for healthy adults. So human heart beats approximately 70 to 85 times per minute in the average adult, and there's a pretty noticeable difference between male and female genders. Now, the average adult male heart rate is between 70 to 72 beats per minute, while the average adult woman is around 78 to 82. And this difference, it's largely accounted for by the actual size of the heart. So typically, the smaller heart is in the girls and the boys have a little bit of a bigger heart. So the smaller female heart is going to pump less blood with each beat, and that means that it actually needs to beat at a faster rate to match the output of the bigger male heart. So you can see in that picture, there's a pretty sizable difference between these two hearts in that picture there. So it's not to say that there's that big of a difference between every boy and girl. This is just of one male and one female, where you can clearly see there's a big size difference between those two subjects. The heart rate, or the resting heart rate of an older adult, functions almost in exactly the same way as a younger heart, except the heart rate actually slightly lowers during rest, and this slight decline occurs at around 60 years old. Now, during exercise, an older person's heart rate doesn't increase as much as a younger person's, and this is known as the maximal heart rate. So max heart rate is the fastest rate at which your heart will beat in 1 minute. So we're talking about probably during exercise now, right? So if you got on a treadmill and did an all-out effort, a maximal effort, your maximal heart rate would be the highest heart rate that you achieved during that all-out effort. Now, our heart rate max, it's a very important number to know, because it can be used to help develop exercise prescription and set exercise intensities, and it can also be used to estimate our aerobic fitness. So we can use some different formulas to estimate or predict our maximal heart rate. You've probably all heard of the Fox formula before, which is 220 minus your age equals your predicted heart rate max. There's also the Tanaka formula, a little bit more complicated. It's thought that this formula is a little bit more accurate. So we take 208 minus your age times by 0.7. And it's important to remember that both of these formulas give you an estimate or a prediction. So they're not 100% accurate. And the only way you're going to get a true measure of your maximal heart rate would be to actually get on that treadmill and do that all-out effort and see how high your heart rate actually gets. So if we're talking about changes in maximal heart rate across the lifespan, we see that the maximal heart rate for both children and adolescents remains constant at anywhere from 195 to 220 beats per minute. So if heart rate for adolescents and children remains constant, it means that these formulas are limited in predicting the heart rate max for this population. Now, for young adult men and women, the maximal heart rate generally peaks at values just underneath 200 beats per minute, and it decreases with maturity. So maximal heart rate declines at approximately 0.87 to 1.02 beats per minute per year of age, right? And interestingly, this rate of decline isn't affected by gender or training status. So we'll see that here. What I mean by this is that the decline is inevitable for both men and women. It doesn't really matter whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whether you're endurance trained or you're sedentary. So what we see in this first image is the age-related decline in heart rate max for men and women. And you can see that there's no gender difference in the decline. Both of those lines are declining on the same slope. You can't even manage to pick out which line is referencing the man and which line is referencing the woman. That's how similar they are. Now, this next graph plots the relationship between maximal heart rate, age, and training status. So the researchers looked at 3 groups: sedentary, active, and endurance trained. And what they found was that there's no significant difference in the decline in maximal heart rate. If we looked specifically at let's take a group of 60-year-olds from this data set, they actually saw that the average maximal heart rate for the sedentary group was 178 beats per minute. So that's the highest their heart rate got in a maximal effort. 178 for the sedentary. In the active group, it was 179. So only 1 beat per minute difference. And then in the endurance trained group, it was 182. So only another couple of beats per minute difference. So there's hardly any difference between those three groups. So what this means is that this decline in maximal heart rate is inevitable. It's the most consistently reported mechanism contributing to the decrease in our aerobic capacity, in our endurance exercise capacity that's associated with aging. So overall, we see from these two graphs here that the progressive decline in heart rate max with age is independent of sex or physical activity. Therefore, it's a non-modifiable, inevitable consequence of aging. And it's actually quite interesting because the mechanisms responsible for this decline, or the reasons as to why this decline occurs with aging, are not well understood. It remains still a little bit of a mystery to researchers. All right, now with each contraction of the heart, a certain volume of blood, called the stroke volume, is ejected from the left ventricle into general circulation via the aorta. So stroke volume is simply the amount of blood pumped out of the heart with each beat. Now, the size of the stroke volume is influenced or limited by many, many factors. This can include the size of the heart. Obviously, the bigger the heart, the more blood it can take in and the more blood it can eject. The contractile force of the myocardial tissue. So if the heart muscle is stronger, it's probably going to be able to pump out more blood with each contraction. Also, the vascular resistance to blood flow and the venous return. So the venous return is the rate at which blood is returned to the heart. So obviously, the greater amount of blood we can return to the heart, the more blood the heart can pump out with each beat. So at all levels of physical work, so from rest to intense exercise, stroke volume is substantially lower in children compared to adults, and that's most likely due to the child having a much smaller heart compared to the adult size heart. Now, this partly actually explains why children have a higher heart rate. So they need a higher heart rate to pump out the amount of blood that they need to circulate around the body. So because they have this small heart size, they need their heart to beat faster to send the oxygen around. Now, at birth, stroke volume is only around 4 milliliters per heart contraction per beat. And this value increases tenfold by adolescence, so around 40 mils in adolescence. And then it remains quite stable until the adolescent growth spurt. At the adolescent growth spurt, it rapidly accelerates and stroke volume increases to 60 mils per beat at rest. Now, just to put those values into a little bit of perspective, a shot, it's normally 30 mils of alcohol. So from birth, 4 mils, that's a tiny amount. And then by the end of adolescent growth spurt, you're double parked now. So let's have a quick look at adulthood. Now, we've got a couple of figures here. We're looking at untrained versus endurance trained, and we're also looking at the stroke volume at rest versus during exercise. So for the untrained adult, the at-rest stroke volume can be anywhere between 60 to 100 mils per beat. And during exercise, this would then increase to 100 to 120 mils per beat. Now, for someone endurance trained, they can eject more blood at rest and during exercise. So they're more efficient in circulating blood throughout the body. They can pump out more blood and circulate that oxygen faster. So at rest, for those endurance trained adults, it's around 100 to 120 mils per beat. And then during exercise, it can actually get up to 150 to 170 mils per beat. Now, for the girls, it's approximately 25% less. So 25% less at rest and then 25% less during exercise. And obviously there is that difference between a sedentary female versus a trained female. So stroke volume is around 25% lower in women at all levels of work on average. Now, like most other physiological parameters, age can affect stroke volume. Now, a person's stroke volume at rest can decline by as much as 30% between the ages of 25 and 85. So, older individuals who perform aerobic exercise regularly can actually minimize this decline in stroke volume. And that's because regular endurance or aerobic training increases our blood volume, it reduces our vascular resistance, it also increases our heart size and increases our venous return, all of which help to maintain a higher stroke volume. Now we're looking at cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount of blood that the heart pumps through the circulatory system in 1 minute. So it's a outcome of heart rate and stroke volume. If we take our beats per minute and multiply that by our stroke volume, we would get our cardiac output. So we know that our heart rate is higher for children than adults, but stroke volume is higher in adults compared to children. So who's going to have the highest cardiac output, a child or an adult? The child has the higher heart rate, but the adult has the higher stroke volume. So even though a child can achieve a higher heart rate, it's not enough to compensate for the lower stroke volume, and therefore cardiac output is much lower in children compared to adults. At rest, adults have a cardiac output of approximately 5 liters per minute. So 5 liters of blood going through your heart and your circulatory system per minute. Now, with the onset of exercise, cardiac output rises in both children and adults until it reaches a new steady state. So there's 2 key factors that affect ultimate cardiac output, and they are our physical condition, so our level of training, and our age. Now, let's talk about training first. So the untrained adult can generally achieve a maximal cardiac output of somewhere between 20 to 25 liters per minute, whereas an endurance-trained adult can actually achieve a maximal cardiac output around 10 liters greater, so 30 to 35 liters per minute. Now, because stroke volume decreases with age, so too does resting cardiac output. So specifically, there's actually a 58% reduction between 25 and 85 years old in the amount of blood that the heart can pump in a minute. But this decline can be minimized through regular aerobic training, and we're going to talk about that in a different part of the lecture. Now, during exercise, there's an increased need for oxygen among the active muscles. So the human's ability to sustain physical work for an extended period is directly related to how much oxygen you can transport to the working tissues. How efficient are you at getting oxygen in to your lungs, through to the blood, and circulate it around the body and deliver it to the tissues? Now, the largest amount of oxygen that a human can consume and deliver to the working muscles is called the maximal oxygen consumption, the VO2 max, right? Now, this physiological measure, it's considered to be the best single measure of aerobic working capacity or physical working capacity. It's the gold standard, and it's measured in milliliters of oxygen consumed in 1 minute per kilogram of body weight. So milliliters per kilogram per minute. Now, in order to measure VO2 max, you have to get onto a machine like shown in this picture here, a treadmill or a bike, and wear this mask. And this mask actually measures the amount of oxygen that you use. So it's a pretty uncomfortable test because remember, you have to exercise to maximum intensity with your nose blocked, wearing this uncomfortable mask. So I'm sure that you can imagine that it's not a very pleasant experience. And it's actually particularly difficult to motivate a young child to complete an all-out effort under these types of conditions. And that's actually one of the main reasons why there's very little data on the VO2 max of infants or young children. However, we can see here the average VO2 max results for boys and girls aged 12 to 18 years there. So that 50th percent is the average. And we can also see what a high VO2 max score for these kids would look like. So if we have a look in that 95th percentile, that would mean if you scored that in a VO2 max at that particular age, you would be in the top 5% of people your age. So if an 18-year-old boy scored around 46, he would be average. If he scored 64 on a VO2 max test, he would be close to the top 5% of boys in his age group. Now, if we have a look at the trends in these figures, we can see that the VO2 max for boys increases from 12 to 18 years. So let's look at that 50th percentile. So it actually increases from 12 to 18 for boys, whereas for young girls, it actually decreases slightly from 39 at 12 years old to 37.4 at 18. So the reasons that boys display an increase or a greater VO2 max compared to girls during these years is likely due to increases in body size. So VO2 max has previously been associated with body size. For example, in boys aged 8 to 12, VO2 max rises around 49%. Now, during this period, the weight of the lungs increases 58% and the heart volume increases by 52%. So it's not as though boys are just getting super fit as they age. It's actually the product of the increase in size. A bigger heart and bigger lungs means that I can get more oxygen into my blood and I can pump more blood around my body to deliver the oxygen to those working muscles. Now, although older children obtain higher VO2 max values than younger children, the discrepancy in the values is no longer as great when we use body weight to standardize the measures. So the average decline that we see in the young girls' VO2 max, it's most likely due to these two key factors: increases in fat mass and a lesser degree of muscle development in the lower extremities. That increase in fat mass occurs during puberty, and the lower amount of muscle means that there's less tissue for oxygen to be consumed, therefore resulting in a lower VO2 max. So if we have a look at the adult VO2 max trends here, we're looking at age in decades, so 20 to 29, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and we can see again the average for men and women, what's in the 50th percentile, and we can also see what would be in the top 5% of these age brackets. So if we have a look at the trends for the average VO2 max in these genders and age groups, what we see with the men is there's a decline in VO2 max from the 20s to the 70s. So going from around 43.9 down to 30.9. Same thing for the women. There's still a decline from around 37 all the way down to about 27 in the 70s. Now, with this figure, you'll also notice that there's two different numbers. There's that first number at the top, and then there's a number in brackets at the bottom. That's just two different sources giving different results. For the purpose of this subject, we'll just take that number that's on the top, not the one that's in brackets, when we're discussing these trends in VO2 max. So what we see there is that that VO2 max declines approximately 9% per decade between 20 years old and 79 years old. It's an overall decline of around 60% from 20 to 79 years of age. Now, with age, the body's ability to acquire and to deliver oxygen to the working tissues is altered, and that results in a reduced physical capacity or aerobic capacity. Now, the rate of decline, we said it's approximately 9% per decade. And this loss of aerobic power, this loss of maximal oxygen consumption, it's caused by many factors, including an increase in fat mass, along with a simultaneous decrease in muscle mass or decrease in lean mass. We also see that decreased cardiac output along with the decreased stroke volume. And we have this decline in physical activity as well during our older years, which can lead to detraining and a decline in our aerobic capacity. All right, so to put things into a bit of perspective regarding these VO2 max numbers, here we see the results for an average 20 to 29-year-old female at 37 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and the average male a little bit higher, around 43 mils per kilogram per minute. Now, there's many sports that promote a high VO2 max. Common ones that you think of are cyclists or endurance runners. But it's actually the cross-country skiers that outdo them all in terms of aerobic capacity. Now, a lot of the highest VO2 max scores ever recorded came from these cross-country skiers. The highest ever female VO2 max recorded was 76 mils per kilogram per minute for this female cross-country skier. And for the men, highest ever recorded, another cross-country skier at 96. Now, there's been a few, maybe one or two male cyclists who've actually scored higher than 96, but should be no surprise to any of you that, of course, the cyclists caught doping. So I've ruled those scores out, okay? So these are the two highest human VO2 maxes. Now, what about when we think about the animals? Are there any animals that have a higher VO2 max? Can you think of an animal that you think would score higher than these cross-country skiers? Now, when I ask this question, a lot of people always want to say a cheetah. But remember, a VO2 max, it's a measure of aerobic fitness, not speed. So you can be the fastest animal on earth, but do you see cheetahs running for hours on end? No, right? They run fast, but it's in short bursts. So we want to know which animal is the most aerobically fit, endurance fit. And the answer is, the one that's the most is a husky, a snow dog, the Siberian husky. The horse is up there as well at 180, but the Siberian husky takes it out at 240 mils per kilogram per minute. Something to think about is how do we actually measure the VO2 max of an animal? Sometimes you can use a treadmill. Horses actually love the big treadmills. Treadmills have also been used to measure the VO2 max of lions, giraffes, cows. For smaller animals, they often use a running wheel, but sometimes it can be a little bit cruel. So it's actually notoriously difficult to get rats to complete an all-out maximal effort to measure their VO2 max. So sometimes they have to use a treadmill with like an electrified bar at the back so that whenever they slack off on the treadmill, they get a little electric shock that tells them to run faster. Now, I know that sounds pretty bad, but there's an even worse way that they can do it. Another way to ensure that the rats will produce this maximal all-out effort, and that's to tie a weight to their tails and put them in a bucket of water and make them swim for their lives. It's so sad, but it definitely ensures that the rat is going to produce this all-out maximal effort and try and save its life. So sometimes science can be a little bit cruel. All right, some key points from this part of the lecture. So we saw that the age-related decline in maximal heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output are going to be major determinants of reduced exercise capacity with aging. We also saw that VO2 max declined an average of 9% per decade from the 20s to 70s in these healthy adults. All right, so moving on to the next part of the lecture now, and we're going to look at how cardiorespiratory fitness influences health, how it influences performance in early life. Okay, so we all know that exercise is important for us, and particularly in early life, during childhood and adolescence. We know there are so many good benefits to aerobic exercise and having good cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, cardiorespiratory fitness and aerobic fitness or endurance can be used interchangeably. Now, in terms of health, having a low cardiorespiratory fitness in childhood can increase our risk of actually developing risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Now, risk factors for cardiovascular disease include things like elevated triglycerides and cholesterol, insulin sensitivity, abnormal blood glucose responses, as well as increased waist circumference, which is often used as an indicator of visceral adiposity, and also increased blood pressure is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Now, aerobic or cardiovascular fitness is a very important marker of health in childhood and adolescence. Cardiovascular disease events like heart attacks, stroke, any sort of blockage or atherosclerosis occur most frequently after our 50s, after the fifth decade of life. However, there's some good evidence now to indicate that the precursors to cardiovascular disease actually have their origin in childhood and adolescence. So cardiovascular disease risk factors, such as those we've just mentioned, have been shown to actually track into adulthood. Now, if we have a look at these results from a study by Ortega, they analyzed the association between cardiovascular profile, so healthy cardiovascular profile, and cardiorespiratory fitness in overweight and non-overweight adolescents. So a higher score in that cardiovascular profile, a higher score on the y-axis, implies a healthier cardiovascular system. Now, the results from this study actually indicate that high levels of aerobic fitness, so high cardiorespiratory fitness to very high CRF, are associated with more favorable cardiovascular profiles in both overweight as well as non-overweight subjects. So now we already know that abdominal obesity in comparison to BMI seems to be a better predictor of overall obesity and a better predictor of the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, as well as a strong predictor of morbidity and mortality in adults. So let's have a little bit of a look closer at the association between cardiorespiratory fitness and either total or abdominal obesity in children and adolescents. So firstly, when we look at this figure, notice how it's got two y-axis. So on the solid line, we're looking at the solid line with the circles filled out, the black circles. That one's looking at total body fat as measured by the sum of 5 skin folds, whereas that broken dotted line is referring to waist circumference, a measure of abdominal adiposity. Now, the results of this study indicate that those individuals with higher cardiorespiratory fitness levels also had significantly lower adiposity, total adiposity, that is, measured by these skin folds. And it was even in the overweight or obese children as well. So those who had a higher cardiorespiratory fitness were shown to also have lower overall adiposity. Now, these results also show that a moderate to high level of cardiorespiratory fitness is associated with lower overall or lower abdominal obesity. All right, so abdominal obesity being that indicator of health and visceral fat. So lower abdominal obesity in those with high cardiorespiratory fitness in childhood and adolescence. If we move away from health for a second and talk about how we can program physical activity to improve the VO2 max of a child or an adolescent, we have some key recommendations here. So to improve the aerobic fitness of a child or an adolescent, there's some clear guidelines or recommendations that they should meet. So this is not the recommendations of the level of physical activity children should be participating in at this age. This is specifically for improving aerobic capacity. So in order to improve VO2 max, children and adolescents should complete a mixture of continuous and interval training using large muscle groups, and they need to exercise around 3 to 4 times per week for 40 to 60 minutes in length. So a key point about exercising to improve VO2 max is that they must work at an intensity of around 85 to 90% of their maximal heart rate. So we can use the formulas that we spoke about earlier in this lecture to calculate an estimate of the target heart rate. And they must actually continue this training schedule for a minimum of 12 weeks long to see a measurable, significant improvement in VO2 max. All right, so some of the key points from this part of the lecture. We saw that cardiorespiratory fitness is associated with cardiovascular disease risk factors. So low cardiorespiratory fitness may increase our incidence of acquiring a cardiovascular disease risk factor. We also saw that cardiorespiratory fitness is associated with total as well as abdominal adiposity. So the higher our cardiorespiratory fitness, the less total fat mass we're likely to have. And finally, it's important that when training to improve VO2 max, we must meet the appropriate intensity guidelines or recommendations of 85 to 90% of heart rate max. So let's say your heart rate max was 200, you'd be attempting to sit at around 170 beats per minute through your session. Okay, guys, so on to part 3 of this lecture. We're going to now look at how cardiorespiratory fitness influences our health and our physical performance in late life, so older adulthood. Now here we're looking at the leading causes of death in Australian men and women. So overall, coronary heart disease is the leading underlying cause of death in Australia, closely followed by dementia, which includes the Alzheimer's disease. Now this figure here shows the number of male and female deaths contributing to the top 5 causes. So the leading cause of death for males was that coronary heart disease, accounting for over 10,000 deaths. And dementia was the leading cause of death for females, and that was very closely followed by coronary heart disease. So what's the difference between coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease? Now, cardiovascular disease, it's an umbrella term which covers all diseases of the heart and blood vessels. That includes heart failure, stroke, coronary heart disease. And specifically, coronary heart disease, it's the narrowing or the blockage of the coronary arteries. And the coronary arteries are the arteries that supply the muscle of the heart with oxygen. So when we talk about risk factors for cardiovascular disease, there's 2 types of risk factors that can increase a person's chance of developing cardiovascular disease. They can be behavioral or physiological risk factors. Now, these 2 are highly related and intertwined, but we can separate them for the purpose of this lecture. So an example of a behavioral risk factor includes diet, inactivity, smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, and often these are modifiable risk factors. And what that means is that I can go out and quit smoking tomorrow. I can go and start exercising as well. So we also have these physiological risk factors, and they include things like our high blood pressure, raised blood sugar, or lipids, or raised cholesterol, also including overweight and obesity as well. So let's have a look at how exercise can help to avoid cardiovascular diseases in the future. Now, in a study by Stewart, they gathered a bunch of middle to older aged adults, so people from 55 to 70 years old who had been diagnosed with untreated high blood pressure. So they got these people to start participating in a training program. The training program involved both resistance and endurance training. So they had to do 2 sets of around 5 resistance training exercises at 50% of their 1RM. So some moderate resistance training, followed by 45 minutes of aerobic exercise at an intensity of 60 to 95% of heart rate max. So they had to do this training 3 times a week for 6 months in total. So 3 times a week, they had to go and do their training, do their little resistance circuit, and then go out and do their 45 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 days a week for 6 months. So let's see what they saw after the 6 months was up. Now, the authors reported significant improvements in aerobic fitness, improvements in lean mass, and improvements in the cardiovascular disease risk factors. So having a look at this figure here, if we compare the black bar or the black column, which signifies the exercise participants' baseline measures, and compare that to the white bar, which is the results of the same group of people after the 6 months of training. Now, you can ignore those grey bars because the grey bars represent the results of a control group. So we're just interested in comparing the black bar to the white bar, which represents basically the pre and the post training results. So we can see that quite a lot of subjects had a decline in their high blood pressure. We also see significant improvement in triglycerides, waist circumference, and indicators of metabolic syndrome. Now, metabolic syndrome, it's just an overall measure of the risk factors that raise your risk of heart disease. So basically, metabolic syndrome, it's just a combination of all of the measures. So the authors reported a significant improvement in a lot of these risk factors for cardiovascular disease. They also reported a significant decrease in total and abdominal adipose tissue. Now, these results are pretty significant. So with just 3 days of training a week, those with high blood pressure can improve their cardiovascular health dramatically. Now, having a look at exercise and mortality. So mortality means death. We're looking at exercise, mortality, and the incidence of chronic disease here. How does our level of cardiorespiratory fitness affect our chance of all-cause mortality or our chance of developing a chronic disease? Now, in a long-term study of over 2,000 participants who were all initially healthy and aged between 40 to 60 years, the researchers documented their baseline level of fitness and grouped them into 4 groups. So group 1 being the lowest fitness and group 4 being those with the highest fitness. So this table shows the data on the incidence of death, cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, and cancer at 16 years after the baseline examinations. So remember that these people were all healthy at baseline, and then they checked back in 16 years later to see whether they died or developed any of these chronic diseases. So first things first, we see a strong association between fitness and mortality and fitness and disease. So if you compare the highest fitness group to the lowest fit group, at 16 years after the baseline measure, almost 20% of the low group had passed away, whereas only 6% of the high fitness group had passed away. The fit group also had a much lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. So in that second column there, we can see only 18% had one of these conditions, whereas in the low fitness group, 31% had at least one of those conditions. Now, overall, they saw that 75% of the fittest group were still alive with no chronic disease. So if you want to increase your chances of aging healthy aging, you definitely want to get yourself up into that highest physical fitness group, highest fitness quartile. Now, something that you may ask yourself is that, what if I wasn't active in my childhood or adolescence or young adulthood? Can I turn things around during my midlife, or am I going to be doomed from those mistakes I made in the past with not making exercise and health a priority? So a very recent study in 2019 actually examined whether an association exists between physical activity patterns across the lifespan and mortality. So this study had 300,000 participants in it, and they found that maintaining physical activity from adolescence into later adulthood was associated with a 29 to 36% lower risk of all-cause mortality than being inactive. So a pretty huge decline in that risk of dying. Now, if you weren't active in adolescence, but you increased your physical activity during midlife, the authors actually found that was associated with around a 30% lower risk for mortality. So although long-term participation in physical activity may be important to lower our risk of dying or disease, this study actually provides evidence that becoming physically active later in adulthood, so from your 40s to your 60s, may actually provide comparable health benefits. So what they're saying is that it's not too late to start physical activity in midlife. Inactive adults should be encouraged to be more active. They can still see major benefits in longevity. Whereas young adults who are already active should strive to continue to maintain their physical activity levels as they get older. All right, so moving on from cardiovascular disease and mortality, let's now have a look at some performance variables, including VO2 max and how VO2 max changes with aging. So we saw previously that VO2 max declines with age. It's due to a few reasons, including the increase in fat mass and decrease in fat mass associated with aging. Also due to decreases in stroke volume and cardiac output and our decrease in physical activity as we get older. So we can see in these figures there is a decline in VO2 max that occurs with age in male and female sedentary individuals. So men consume more oxygen than women, so you can probably already guess that the men are the blue diamonds and the women are the red squares in these two figures. So for the sedentary, there's a decline with age there. Now, for the endurance-trained people, this is looking at a group of Ironman athletes. We still see that decline in VO2 max. The decline still occurs with age, but it's only after a peak in around the late 20s. So see that shape of the curve for the endurance-trained participants actually peaks first and then declines with age. So overall, the endurance-trained athletes have a greater capacity to process more oxygen at all ages. And we know that training enhances VO2 max. So let's have a look at how the decline in VO2 max compares in endurance-trained and sedentary individuals. So looking at this first picture on the left, we can clearly see that whether it's for sedentary, active, or endurance-trained participants, the age-associated decline in VO2 max is inevitable. However, with training, we can bump up our VO2 max so that the decline doesn't reach too low. Now, in the next column graph, we can see that there's an average decline in VO2 max per decade at around 9%. So we spoke about that in the first part of the lecture, 9% per decade on average. Now, there's very small differences in the rate of decline per decade in the other two populations, maybe around 7% or so in active and maybe 6.5% in endurance trained. So the key takeaway is that the rate of decline doesn't actually vary much whether we're trained or not trained, whether we're an endurance athlete or whether we're sedentary. But what we do see is that having a higher VO2 max throughout life means that we can actually try to avoid having our VO2 max drop too low when we age. And this is a really important concept because if we have a look at this figure on this slide, what we can see is that if we compare someone who's aerobically trained and someone who's sedentary, if we want to know at what age they have the same VO2 max, we can look at those arrows and see that actually an aerobically trained 80-year-old could have the same VO2 max as a sedentary 50-year-old. So this figure also shows something called the frailty threshold. Now, this threshold is defined as a VO2 max of less than 18 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is where you have a clinical syndrome that means you have a very high level of health risk. In most cases, a VO2 max of 18, that's like you're about to have a heart surgery, you're lying on the table about to go in if your VO2 max is 18. So it's not good. And with aerobic training, we can actually delay the onset of this frailty threshold. The way that we treat our bodies can have a huge influence across our lifespan. And this has been demonstrated by some, outstanding athletic elderly people. My favorite of these is definitely Olga. At 93 years old, she's competing in the athletics in the track and field sports for Canada. There she is doing her shot put. And isn't she just, so cute when she runs? So unfortunately, Olga passed away in 2014. But even in her 90s, she was setting world records, winning gold medals. And, I won't let you tell me that she's not the best. Look at her going for that high jump there. I've got to be honest, that's probably better than what I can do. 23 world records for her age. So we should all aspire to be a little bit like Olga. All right, so what information can you take away from this lecture? So it's clear that aerobic fitness is associated with declines in cardiovascular disease, and cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. So, of course, we'd want to decline our risk of cardiovascular disease. We also saw that aerobic fitness is associated with lower all-cause mortality and the prevalence of chronic diseases such as cancer and diabetes. And finally, we saw that aerobic training may reduce the age-related decline in cardiorespiratory function and aerobic capacity. Okay, guys, so we've gone through the cardiorespiratory system and how our cardiovascular or cardiorespiratory fitness changes across the lifespan.